Hey, welcome to Life Support. I'm so glad you're here today. What we do on this program is we want you to find a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ. And God does use suffering. He uses trauma in order to do that. So we tell stories, and I hope that you're encouraged today. My guest is Todd Mulliken. He's a licensed professional clinical counselor. He's also a prof at Minneapolis College. He's an author. And Todd, thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.
It's great to see you. And we talked a lot last time about some of the dynamics in the home. And you made a comment right when we were finishing up about the interaction between being right and being liked. Tell me about that, and tell me how that kind of figures into a Christian home experience for a couple that's trying to live for Christ. Maybe it's running into some of those dynamics.
Yeah, well, if we think of the Gospel of John, Jesus came full of two things, full of truth and full of grace. And just one thing I've experienced with a lot of couples I've worked with is a reality that oftentimes in marriage, one person is really good with the truth part of speaking truth, being decisive, kind of calling things out, making the tough call, but they might lack some of the grace piece, right? It's more fire ready aim. Okay. Yeah. And then, so sometimes their default is just needing to be right. Kind of a last word Larry, last word Lorraine. Their best stuff is, God, they'll get in there and clean things up and not avoid messes. And we need that. And the other side of the street is somebody that's a little bit more vulnerable to that people-pleasing side. They just want to be liked, right? But they bring a lot of good grace stuff. They bring, Colossians 3 big time, right? The humility, the compassion, the grace upon grace, just that sense of harmony and wanting things to go okay. And we need that too, right? But their struggle is under stress. They tend to avoid messes, minimize it. And if they're not careful, if they've had a disagreement with their spouse 14 years ago on a Tuesday, they still remember that and have a little resentment bank account that draws money at that point. Yeah. Versus, hey, I needed to say what was on my mind too. So I just noticed that dynamic with lots of couples, and then that can play out in their parenting styles too. Does that make sense? The person that wants to be right is a little bit more, too authoritarian under stress versus making sure their kids know their own feelings and their kids have a chance to express what's on their mind, whether they want to say 2 words or talk for an hour. How am I not just being the last word, kind of shut up and listen? How am I saying, hey, as a healthy leader, here's my perspective on it, here's what we're going to do, but I really want to know what you're thinking. So the kids can know what they're feeling and thinking. And then the grace-based parent needs to work on actually following through with the correction, with the discipline. If we're beyond curfew, here's what we talked about, here's what needs to happen, versus being the kid's friend. So I think it's good to know your own personality style, because I've really seen lots of couples like that get vulnerable around halftime with the controller not knowing there's anything wrong and the pleaser building up resentment. And so how do we get ahead of that early on? How does a pleaser speak more truth and not build resentment and just come out to play more and engage more? How does that need to be right person kind of step back and make sure they're creating interactions, not interrogations? So it's just an observation I've made.
That's a good one too. And as we live through this pandemic, I'm sure some of that's been heightened because everything is stressful and new, and we're kind of been together a lot more than normal.
Right.
Which our wives will point that out.
They will. They will.
You're always here.
Don't you have to go?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Oh, you're home already. No, I'm just kidding. And I'm more extrovert. My wife's more introverted, so we're laughing already as we're speaking about this. Yeah, you're right. So, it's interesting though, Paul. I would say some couples, it's really helped because they finally do get time together because they never had any, because one's traveling all the time or they're just 2 ships passing. So now they're doing quality walks and just like, oh my gosh, that's why I fell in love. I forgot. The other people that have been home a lot are now home all the time, and trying to work while they're doing school with the kids and everything. It's just chronically stressful. So I think it's different for everybody, and we just need to, as a church and as individuals and friends, just pay attention to that and know what people are battling, what they're going through.
How are kids doing through this pandemic, and are you concerned for them?
Yeah, for sure. I'm concerned, and apathy seems to be kind of king and queen with what I'm seeing with a lot of students I'm seeing, is that they're just apathetic, they're tired. They're fatigued, and depression shows up. We talk about depression with, things like suicidal thinking and excessive guilt, feelings of worthlessness, but 4 of the 10 symptoms of depression are all about energy, lack of interest in activities, chronic fatigue, depressed mood more often than not each day, just energy stuff, right? So people have been sapped of their energy, so they're just more vulnerable to being more depressed. And we have more uncertainty, maybe we're getting a little bit more certain, but we've had a lot of uncertainty. So people with anxiety that are already in the what if house have more uncertainty. Mm-hmm. So what you said is so perfect, Paul. Things are just louder now for people. Mm-hmm. Things have been magnified.
And I would guess that kids aren't really sharing how they're really feeling, right?
Yeah, overall. And again, it's common, and so it's not bizarre or unusual. I mean, as a parent, are we doing the best we can to still create opportunities for that kiddo to be in community, even if it's on, over virtual or whatever? Just how are we trying to create spaces, or they got a bubble they're in, or now we're trying to navigating out of the pandemic a little bit. How are we creating space for that? So we just want to pay attention to connections and how are we giving our kids, based on their age, opportunities for connections. And we have to be creative about it. Maybe less creative now as we're trying to ease towards more post-pandemic stuff, but just paying attention. The most important thing, especially if kids are 12 to 18, most of their identity really is in their peer structures. So how are we creating opportunities for them to find a place, whether that's that one friend they haven't seen for a while, or it's, a community, a sports activity, whatever energizes them. How are we trying to make that happen as best as we can as parents?
So many guests that have been through trauma have come on this program, and they've talked about their trauma as the suicide of one of their children. And it's shockingly common, and their stories are very similar. The effects, of course, are awful. If my child's not going to tell me necessarily I'm feeling this way, what are some signs I can look out for that I might want to intervene and to be concerned?
Well, certainly family history matters, right? So if I know of a family member that has had a mental health condition, I'm paying more attention. Depression usually with adolescents will show up with either more intense irritability outwardly or inwardly, right? And it also can show up with just, like I mentioned earlier, lack of interest in activities and just getting more sullen and withdrawn. And you see it usually go into many parts of their story, not just an academic issue, but a friendship issue as well as an in-home issue. So it tends to, depression usually comes in episodes, as I've said an earlier thing with you. An episodic depression, which can be a trigger for suicidal thinking for sure, is that wave of depression, usually 2 to 4 weeks of very loud, depressive stuff that's really hard. So, the best we can do as parents is probably know about those family history issues and then what we're noticing in our kids, and trying to create safe spaces, for them to be who they are, and pay attention to those things as best as we can.
Yeah, for sure. And what I hear you saying is they need just a lot of encouragement.
Mm-hmm. They do, and typically if a child or adolescent or an adult for that matter is battling even mild depression, they're already hard enough on themselves. And that's where it gets hard as a parent, when we're dealing with somebody that there may even be like bipolar disorder in the family. And bipolar disorder, the depressive episodes are very, especially with bipolar 2, we call it, which is people that are more vulnerable with the swings to be more depressed longer. And when they come out of it, the bipolarity is more hypomania, not as intense of mania. So with those kiddos that have bipolar 2 or that runs in the family, that's really hard because usually the depressive condition lasts for weeks. And so it is hard, and they need encouragement, but it's hard as a parent to know what to say and how to do the right thing in the right time.
Yeah. And now you have a situation where everybody in the home is experiencing some kind of trauma. And there are family units. My family would be an example of everyone's been through trauma at some level, not related to the pandemic, but everyone's got their triggers. Everybody gets tired. People fight depression. What do parents do if they're just exhausted and kind of running out of gas?
Yeah, I do think it's important, if the family has been through trauma, is just keeping aware of the stages of grief. And it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're all set. We fly around to all those stages, right? So we give space and time for that bargaining phase of, oh, we should have, or this or that, or time to just really be sad and really grieve hard. Time to just be angry for what's happened. Time for, maybe acceptance that's fleeting. But we know that people grieve in different ways and in different time zones, if you will. Mm-hmm. And we can't rush grief. And so we just need to be as empathetic as we can to each other in the family system to know that we're all grieving and grieving in different ways.
Is it tempting for a parent to just focus on the child and bury their own feelings and grief?
It can be. I mean, yeah, I think that's a great call out. And I think it's, we're so in our own pain so much, we just really want to take on our child's pain and maybe overmanage or be overly concerned and be triggered ourselves. And post-traumatic stress disorder has 3 symptom clusters to it, so that when you and I are triggered, we're either vulnerable to what we call hyperarousal symptoms, where we're lit up like a Christmas tree and we're just irritable, we're ragey, we're just really scared, and we'll end up usually being very controlling and over-managing. Some people have avoidance symptoms, which are just repressed, shut down, turtle up, and just are just so sad and sullen. Mm-hmm. And then the 3rd symptom cluster, which is probably even the most tricky, really, is negative alterations in our thinking and our mood, which means if we're being triggered from the grief, from the trauma, we're really vulnerable to assuming the worst will happen again. And so because the worst has happened, so we're thinking it will happen again. And kind of the body's way of protecting ourselves and our thinking style. So those 3 symptom clusters of PTSD are good to know about, but it's hard when triggers happen. So that's why we need to come around each other in the family and leave space and time that different people will be triggered in different ways. And we know about how PTSD works, and we understand each other's pain as best as we can.
The grieving cycle confused me for a long time, because the first thing they give you when you're experiencing the death of a loved one is they hand you a little book. It's got the 5 stages of grief. Mm-hmm. And you just assume that you should be following that track along. And one thing I've learned is that you can try to stuff these feelings, and it works for a little while. But they're going to end up someplace. They're not just going to dissipate. Yeah. And then I find that some stage will just come up out of nowhere for maybe an extended period of time. Mm-hmm. The problem is nobody else in my family is there. Mm-hmm. My friends don't really understand because they're not there.
Yeah.
And so it can cause you to feel alone, isolated, and somewhat, I guess, a little bit, loose around the edges. Like, mm-hmm. What is wrong with me? Mm-hmm. So how do you handle all of these things that keep popping in and out all of the time?
Yeah, great question. I'm probably saying this too much, but empathy always wins. And what I mean by that is, so if I'm going through it myself and I'm really just crushing myself, the best I can do in that moment, probably even before that moment when I kind of sense, I'm going in, it's going to be a while. Yep. It's coming, the wave's here. The best I can do, not as a silver bullet, but just as a way of understanding, am I trying to view myself as God sees me right now? Because I know, he's for me. I know he's holding me, and I know I'm in deep pain, but God understands it, and thank God, God understands it. Which isn't meant to be we're not going to go through that deep, and you said it perfectly, like we fly around to all those stages, and we're usually in one what none of the other people are in, and so I think we have to first kind of do the best we can to reboot, knowing how God sees us so we can receive that care during this time of deep suffering. I think that's a good first step to try to do, to give ourselves permission to go there. And that doesn't rescue us out of our feelings, but at least knows, hey, I know a guy.
Yeah.
I know a guy.
Yeah.
I know the Lord, mm-hmm. I know he's been through the worst, and mm-hmm. Okay, at least I've got that right now.
And to give yourself permission to feel it?
Oh, thank you. Mm-hmm. Big time. I mean, mm-hmm. You said it perfectly. I mean, the older I get, Paul, I think avoiding is worse than overreacting. You know, and so if I'm more vulnerable to avoiding any kind of emotion, it's going to leak at some point. So how do I address versus avoid? So if it's there, that's usually what I'm telling people in grief counseling is just whatever emotion is there, please, experience them.
Yeah, one of my first grief counselors after Taylor passed away would just tell me, what can you throw around in your garage that's not going to hurt anybody?
Right.
So, well, I got a plastic garbage thing. Good. Go out there and throw it as hard as you can as long as you want to. The problem is, in the culture we live in, and especially, I guess, not trying to be unfair to the church, but in our Christian culture, those displays of emotion really aren't appreciated.
Yeah.
It's hard to know what to do with that.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think we tend to view, anger made the feeling sheet, by the way, Paul. I mean, anger made it.
Yeah.
It made it. So
yeah.
it's in there. And, you don't need me to tell you, like, Lord, brought it. I was asked on a show not too long ago, well, what about turning the other cheek? I said, well, Lord asked us to turn the other cheek, but he didn't really turn the other cheek with the Pharisees. He kind of got all over them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So there's a time to throw stuff around the garage emotionally or literally, right?
Yeah.
There's a time for that. And I totally agree with that. And there's a time to be, quiet and listen. But there's a time for all of that.
Yeah, it's all part of who we are. Well, it's how God made us.
Absolutely.
Can't deny that.
No. And I think it's tricky, as you said so well, with families when we're wired a little differently than, if I'm a 30 or 25-year-old and my parent is a little wired differently than I am. And I think, well, it's easy to get judgy on a different family member when they're wired differently. Yeah,
it really is. And it's easy to get judgy with our other Christian brothers and sisters.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's why I find myself doing a lot more listening than giving answers.
Usually when I find myself thinking, I just don't understand that, that's when God will say, well, you really should because you do stuff that's worse than that.
That's right.
Somehow God's pretty good at reminding me about that. But boy, judging is it's hard to avoid sometimes because that sin problem is still very much there. So as we come out of this pandemic, Todd, in the few minutes we have left here, finally we're starting to see the back end of this thing, it looks like. What counsel might you give a family to try to go through another adjustment from being locked down, not having a lot of freedom, to all of a sudden having the world kind of reopen to them? Is it as simple as just talking about how we're feeling, what we want to do, how we want to proceed, or is it more complicated than that?
It's not a bad place to start. And sometimes, everybody knows their family, different families, different rules at some level in terms of how we go about communicating with, 6 kids versus 1 or whatever. Are we one-on-one? What's the best way to bring out their best? And how are we giving them space to say, what are we for coming out of this? To have people look at what they're for versus what they're against, and what will be life-giving versus energy-draining. What in our non-academic time, in our non-sports time, whatever we're doing with our time, when we get time to have Sabbath or rest or relax, what are we doing that's really life-giving? And that may be different for different family members. But that's a part of how we come out of the pandemic, is do what does bring life to us again, and we get to do that. And that might be different for different family members. But I think you're right. We got to at least have an opportunity to talk about that.
And I would think that goes for being at work, it goes for being at church, talk, listen, because everyone's going to come out of this thing at different speeds and in different ways, I would think.
Yeah, and how are we kind of being the bigger people to leave space for that versus getting all pharisaical about it, right? Are we kind of saying, yeah, I get that. Here's what I'm going through. How about you? So I really believe, especially these days, Paul, are we creating interactions with our our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, with our family members, or are we creating interrogations? Are we creating an interaction, a volley? Here's my take on how I'm getting out of this. How about you? What are you doing? That's how we're walking alongside.
Interrogating is much easier, though. And I feel much more right when I do it that way, when I interrogate.
Yeah.
I can feel better about myself.
It's funny, that's who Jesus got the most upset with.
Yeah, I've been there. But, it's going to be interesting, and it's not going to be easy. And but, I'm just very, very thankful that God has brought us to this point, and that, here we are. We're still walking with Jesus. The church, big C, is going to get healthier than ever, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
because I think there's been some refinement that's been done. I just hope we don't forget the lessons that we've been learning through this past year and a half, because I think God's been doing some pretty heavy teaching. Tell me about your practice, because you're doing a lot of stuff there.
Yeah, I've never been busier, and it's been I do work probably too many days out of the week, but mostly see couples, but I see individuals as well, and dealing with anxiety, depression, couples dealing with communication issues, conflictual problems, and chronic trauma. So just toddmulliken.com is where to find, and they make appointments there through that. And
very good.
Yeah,
it's really great to see you.
Paul, it's great to see you. Thanks for having me.